Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Michelle Gold, Board Chair of Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust. Thank you for joining us for today's program, which is presented by our museum along with the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education and the Jewish History Museum and Holocaust History Center in Tucson. We planned this program several weeks ago when we were all quite focused on the COVID-19 pandemic and the effects of the pandemic and the quarantine on public health and on the economy. This was before we all saw the horrific image of George Floyd dying at the hands of police in Minneapolis, and before the nation erupted in protest against the racism that pervades policing and the rest of our society. As a Holocaust museum, we teach the lessons of history, the disastrous consequences when one group is marginalized and treated as less worthy than other groups. We now stand at a moment when history is being made, and we stand in solidarity with those demanding an end to violence and structural racism against Black Americans. The death of George Floyd is a harsh reminder of the deep-rooted racism that exists in our country. Prejudice affects many different groups, and unchallenged hate rhetoric encourages people to believe that discrimination and even violence against particular groups of people are acceptable. Today, we will be discussing a particular form of prejudice and hatred, anti-Semitism. It is my pleasure to introduce our two distinguished guests who are with us today, Michael Berenbaum and Stephen Wasserstrom. Michael Berenbaum is the director of the Ziggy Ziering Institute, exploring the ethics of the Holocaust, and a professor of Jewish studies at the American Jewish University. He is the author and editor of 20 books. He was also the executive editor of the second edition of the Encyclopedia Judaica. He was project director overseeing the creation of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and the first director of its research institute. And he later served as president and CEO of the Survivors of the Shoah Visual History Foundation. Welcome, Michael.
Good to be with you.
It's a pleasure to have you. Stephen Wasserstrom, welcome to you. Stephen is the Mo and Izetta Tonkin Professor of Judaic Studies and the Humanities at Reed College in Portland, Oregon, where he's been teaching since 1987. His books include Between Muslim and Jew, The Problem of the Symbiosis Under Early Islam. He has been an invited fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and a member of the working group on Messianism, the Tikva Project on Jewish Thought at Princeton. Stephen, welcome. Thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
The views expressed by the speakers are theirs alone and do not necessarily represent the views of the organizations they represent or the organizations presenting today's program. Towards the end of the program, both our guests will answer audience questions. So if you do have a question, please click on the Q&A and type in your questions there. And with that, Michael and Stephen, the platform is yours, and thank you again for joining us.
Okay, it's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. We agreed on a format which will make it clear to our audience. We're going to do a brief wrap-up of how we saw anti-Semitism going into the current crises. And we really have three crises, namely the virus, the financial crises, and now the unrest associated with the death of George Floyd. And it's very important that we deal with what it was like going in, and then speculate a little bit about what it might be like at the other end of this current situation. We agreed that Steve would go first, and I will follow up. Steve, it's all yours.
Thank you. I have the somewhat unenviable position of trying to cover quite a considerable amount of ground, but let me try very briefly. First of all, I think we don't need to get into semantic questions which are likely to arise. For example, the difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism. We might want to return to that point. More generally, anti-Judaism has framed and given rise to what we normally call anti-Semitism for the last 2,000 years, because the New Testament and the Quran both prominently feature Jews in various negative lights. As a consequence, Jews who lived under the host civilizations of Christianity and Islam, respectively, suffered in various ways. The one point that I would want to emphasize with regard to this religiously based anti-Judaism is that there is, I think, a common misconception that the problem of Islamic anti-Judaism is somehow particularly perniciously rooted in the Quran in some fundamental and violent way. That is, however we might want to discuss that, the point I want to emphasize is that Jews lived under Islam for more than 500 years, largely peacefully and largely productively, before the center of Jewish world life shifted across the Mediterranean to Europe. There's no reason to try and make this point explicit why Muslims and Jews can't get along based scripturally. There's nothing in the Quran necessarily that is violently anti-Jewish. We can discuss the point, but the history of the Jews under Islam was more positive, broadly speaking, than Jews under Christianity. That's one point. That's the religion side. In more recent years, particularly the last couple centuries, we've had a strange bifurcation of anti-Semitism, political anti-Semitism, and political anti-Semitism that is peculiarly both from the left and from the right. In very recent years, we've seen the anti-Semitism from the right we're all more or less familiar with from the history of Europe, less so in the United States. And in more recent years, extreme left anti-Semitism has arisen in North America and particularly in Europe. What all that means is that we have various kinds of political and various kinds of religious anti-Judaism that we need to discuss. Before all of that, before the current crisis, let me make this one last point about that historically, and that is all of that much of that, those forms of anti-Judaism were starting to, at least let's stick with the United States for the moment, starting to get worse over the last 3 years or so, and the indicators of anti-Jewish violence in Europe and particularly in North America rose steeply in the past few years. Much of that is, in a sense, on hold during the present crisis, and we don't really know what the current crisis will mean for what was the unfortunate escalation of active anti-Semitism in North America. That's something we might want to explore today. I think I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve.
Let me pick up on where Steve left off. I think for clarity's sake, we have to say that one has to understand the source of anti-Semitism. And we can speak of multiple sources. There can be religious anti-Semitism, which we defined or spoke of as anti-Judaism. There can be political anti-Semitism, meaning in the rivalry for power. There can be economic anti-Semitism, which views the Jews as an economic threat or views the Jews as an economic problem. There can be racial anti-Semitism, which primarily we experienced with regard to Nazism, when the Jews were considered a race. And there also is a question not only of the source of anti-Semitism, but how important anti-Semitism is to the anti-Semite, how much of a priority it is. Namely, if they see the Jews as the root of all evil, as the source of all evil, or they see the Jews as one of the problems resulting in society. And the third element is, where do we stand on the totem pole? I want to argue very simply. I'm going to argue 4 arguments very quickly for the sake of clarity. I want to say that Jews see themselves in a way that they are not seen by others today. The best example is Israel, in which the Israelis see themselves as a community that is besieged, that faces intractable and interminable enemies of enormous power and influence, and sees itself as David opposing Goliath. The Israelis are seen opposite that. They are seen as a regional military superpower and a high-tech powerhouse. What is positively called the startup nation becomes a nation that's equipped to handle globalization with the financial resources and the gross net income that's comparable to Switzerland, which is considered a significant economic achievement. Jews in America are now regarded, we regard ourselves as a minority. We are regarded by many Americans as a privileged part of the white majority. And that's a significant accomplishment, something that was not true into the world in which Steve and I were born, in which Jews were outsiders rather than insiders, and that manifests itself in a variety of different ways as privileged parts of the white majority. Some regard us not quite or tentatively white, and white supremacists regard us in a very particular way, certainly as not white, and as a source for diluting white power and for diluting what we might call at this moment white privilege. I want to argue, secondly, that anti-Semitism has a mixed bag at this moment. If you look at the Pew survey, Judaism is the most admired of the American religions today. That means, in one sense, if we look at it, it is the least problematic of the American religions. Roman Catholicism has a division between pew and pulpit. Roman Catholicism suffered a crisis with regard to the priesthood and the bishops. It is also suffering a tension between a conservative leadership and a liberal pope, which is going to evolve over a period of time. Protestantism is divided between evangelical and mainstream, and evangelical Protestantism is divided generationally over certain issues such as politicalization, the environment, and interestingly enough, also the gay issue. And people had been trained to expect terrorism to come from Muslim sources. Consequently, Judaism becomes the least unpopular and the least unadmired, the most admired. But then we have to ask, unless Americans are anti-Semitic today as a percentage of the population than ever before, But why is it that anti-Semitism then is correctly perceived as being on the rise? I want to argue three things. Number one, that we have a dramatic change in the sense that the anti-Semites now have a megaphone, which is called the internet, and a social support system, which are the social networks. Therefore, they are heard and they are seen, and they feel mutually supportive. And the previous Jewish communal strategy of quarantining them, pressing them aside, because if we isolate them, they cannot have impact, faces a countervailing force, which is, in the countervailing force is the social support network they enjoy. You want one interesting example. Syracuse University had an anti-Semitic, racial, anti-Black and anti-immigrant and anti-foreign students and anti-Asian students crisis this past fall. And there was a widespread rumor, though not documented, that the manifesto, the rage that was expressed in New Zealand, was placed on student phones when somebody walked through the library. And he or she put it on student phones, which meant an event in New Zealand now had an impact on the university campus in a library in which all of that was being expressed. The most important thing to me is not only the manifesto, not only the internet and the social support network, but we now have circumstances in which if you hate, you do not feel restrained in the expression of your hatred. There used to be a requirement of civility, and in fact, in the 40s and 50s, when anti-Semitism was still far more widespread than it is today, when it had social support networks on the left from Marxism and on the in Christianity from the tension between Christianity and Judaism. If you felt anti-Semitic, you didn't express it because it wasn't said in polite company. Today, you have a sense of the freedom to be authentic to yourself, and if that means expressing hatred and expressing racism and expressing a whole range of things, you have that, and you don't have a restraint on that. But my last point I want to make comes back to how do we counteract it in a very real way? And this is, I think, one of the lessons learned by Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh, in the aftermath of the anti-Semitism that manifested itself in the Tree of Life, Pittsburgh developed a slogan called Pittsburgh Strong, which meant in essence Pittsburgh United. The World Series paused for a moment of silence for the Pittsburgh 11. The Pittsburgh Steelers and the Pittsburgh Penguins put on a Jewish star. Mrs. Rogers, the husband of Mr. Rogers, who was probably the great moral teacher to an entire generation of children, and whose voice is desperately needed today to make sense of all of this, came out in order to protect and to defend her neighborhood. And her neighborhood was Squirrel Hill in Pittsburgh. The mayor was there, the governor was there, the district attorney was there. Religious leadership came forth, and interestingly enough, the Muslim community came forth with $250,000 or more contribution in order to support those who had been wounded and injured from the attacks on it. We had one incident that we have to reflect, which is political, which is the president came, but he did not speak. And he was accompanied by the Israeli ambassador, who also did not speak. And the reason for that is because our president is not a figure who unites, he divides. And while he may not be an anti-Semite and has said and done many positive things for Israel and the like, he is heard as giving a green light to the expression of hatred. And instead of bringing the American people together, He has been a divisive figure, and we have an increase, a radical increase in polarization and radical increase in venom. Steve, take it from here, please.
Okay, gentlemen, if I may, I would like to ask each one of you a question. And the first one I'm going to address it to is to you, Michael, and that is, in your opinion, has the COVID-19 crisis resulted in increased cooperation and between Israel and the Palestinian Authority? And if so, do you think that will pave the way for continuing cooperation once the public health crisis has subsided?
That's a terrific question. And let me modify the question for a moment. The most positive development we've seen on the front of anti-Semitism has been the backdoor cooperation, which even became open, between Israel and its Arab countries in the Middle East to fight the coronavirus. You had an explicit manifestation of that when the United Arab Emirates sent a plane directly from the UAE into Ben Gurion Airport with provisions to help the Palestinians. The PLO, the Palestinian government did not accept those, so it went to Gaza. But also, if you look at the cooperation between physicians who have been working together, there is now a deep professional cooperation on how to combat the coronavirus. There is a de facto agreement between Israel and a de facto alliance between Israel and the Sunni Muslims against the Shia Muslims, most particularly Iran. And the question that we have to ask is, what is the moment at which that translates down to the people? In the case of divorce, there's always a question, when do you tell your children? And the question becomes, when does leadership tell the population that Israel is not the source of evil, but can be beneficial to the region? And that was the original dream of Zionism, was that all would benefit from the type of dynamism that Zionism offered to the region. It didn't come that way, but that also might have an impact in the long run, not only on the questions of the Middle East, but the questions also domestically in terms of Muslim hostility toward Israel and Jews. And the last thing to say is, all bet one of the crises impacting Israel today is the question of annexation, and whether there will be a great response to the annexation issue, and whether that goes against the increased levels of cooperation that we've seen, and whether that sets sparks off. Nobody knows the answer to that question, but it's one we have to consider.
What we do know is that COVID does not respect boundaries. And there is a potential silver lining. I agree with Michael, and it's quite possible that all the ossified and petrified boundaries between these groups are being shaken up currently. Let me just add that the unprecedented nature of this shakeup is further exacerbated by something Michael alluded to earlier, which is globalization and digitalization more generally, which are crossing boundaries all the time and in making mixing between the groups much more complicated, much more accelerated, and in many ways much more potentially positive. Let me just underscore one other point while we're talking about Israel and the Arab-Israeli conflict, and that is as a scholar of religion, I believe strongly that there's no religious reason between Islam and Judaism why that this kind of hope for peace can't be established eventually.
And thank you, Stephen. And my next question was actually addressed to you, and that is, as we try to predict the fallout from COVID-19 pandemic, we are to some extent looking at uncharted waters. But are there historical examples we can look to, examples of either severe economic downturn or public health crisis, or both, that gives us clues about what we might expect?
I'm not a modern European historian, and what I'm going to say now is obviously dire and may not even be that particularly supported historically. I'm not sure. But one thing that concerns me specifically in this regard is that the 1918 influenza epidemic, again, didn't respect boundaries and shook up the world and destroyed countless lives. It was in the wake of that pandemic that we had the rise of Nazism in very short time afterwards in Germany. So there was the devastation to economies that also followed the World War I, but it was certainly exacerbated by the terrors of the pandemic, and one has to worry a little bit, depending on obviously how much more deeply we're going to be affected by this pandemic, that it may shake up national and international relations in ways that might be.
Let me add to that three very basic things. Number one, if we go back into medieval history, you have the question of the Black Death. And Jews were also accused of poisoning the wells. We have and will have conspiracy theories that emerge from this. And the conspiracy theories bear very little relationship to reality. One of the interesting conspiracy theories developing on the net these days is that that Bill Gates is one of the people who brought us the coronavirus. And he brought it to us in order to profit from developing the vaccine. Now, Bill Gates is the second richest man in the world, and his concern the last 8 or 9 years has been philanthropy rather than money making. If they can attack Bill Gates, who has given hundreds of millions of dollars to this, then they certainly can attack George Soros, who has been accused of multiple crimes, and we're going to see and included. And if Israel develops the vaccine, there will be the conspiracy theory that Jews brought the virus in order to profit from creating the vaccine. The second thing I want to say is we're now in an almost perfect storm, because you're using the word COVID-19, and this is the way we dealt with it. COVID-19 is a public health crisis. People are afraid for their lives. The economic consequences of them also does not respect boundaries, and that people are now afraid not only for their lives, but for their livelihood. And what we've seen recently in the United States with the question of Black Lives Matter and the question of the role of policing and the like, is that racial tensions have reached a peak, and the call for racial justice have reached enormous proportions. And if that's not realized in something dramatic and significant, there's going to be a lot of fallout from that. We are headed to an election campaign, which again was one of the elements of polarization. So my imagination fails me as to what would be an even more perfect storm than that. But this is quite enough of a perfect storm to intensify all sorts of tensions.
And actually,
we're at a dangerous and somewhat frightening moment.
Absolutely. Absolutely. My next suggestion for both you gentlemen was to, if we could have between yourselves, a discussion on anti-Semitism versus anti-Zionism in the time specifically of COVID-19.
Michael?
Yeah, let me say that let me again say three things. Number one, let's differentiate between criticism of the policies of the State of Israel and anti-Semitism, and criticism of policy of the State of Israel and anti-Zionism. It is fully and totally legitimate to criticize the policies of the State of Israel. Even its most ardent supporters are forced to believe that Israel is an imperfect society, because if they read the newspapers every day, there is ample evidence of that, and that Israelis themselves criticize their country vehemently. David Hartman, one of the great teachers of the last generation, once said that he wished that criticism of Israel was criticism of a mother and not a mother-in-law. Criticism by a mother and not a mother-in-law. In other words, it's said with the affection and the esteem understood, and now you better get yourself into shape, and not finding all sorts of nitpicking. What is the boundary line between anti-Semitism and criticism of the State of Israel? Sharansky has given us a very interesting boundary line. It's called the three, and he gave it to us in a way that we can remember. It's the 3 Ds. It's double standards, delegitimation, and demonization. If you judge Israel by one standard and the rest of the world by another standard, then that borders on, can go over to, can morph into anti-Semitism. If you say Israel is an imperfect society, even if you say Israel is founded on the lands of native populations, but so is the United States, so is Australia, so is Canada, so are multi countries, and nobody says the United States, Canada, and Australia, for example, don't have the right to exist. So once you say that Israel's founding is not a virgin birth, that once you use that for delegitimation, it has the possibility of anti-Semitism and morphs into it. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, demonization. If you believe that Israel's the source of all evil and is demonic, that becomes clear and total anti-Semitism, and something that must be understood as such. And one of the things about Israel's usefulness in the coronavirus epidemic to the Arab world and the Arab neighbors is that knocks down the perception of demonic. Remember that there is, to all forces, there is what C. Wright Mills once called the myth of omnipotence and the myth of impotence. C. Wright Mills used a wonderful example. He said, when Joseph McCarthy said there are 26 communists in the State Department, and the State Department has turned over China, has lost China to the communists. What he's not saying is there are 28,242 wonderful patriotic Americans, but what he is saying is 26 people can manipulate the entire thing. That's the myth of omnipotence. We see that with George Soros. The accusation is what Soros has now sponsored Black Lives Matters thing. He was also the sponsor of the caravan. I mean, the man, it must be all powerful because it's erupted in multiple cities and the like. That's the myth of omnipotence. The myth of impotence is I can criticize them and they're going to not be able to do anything to me. So it's the combination of things that come forward. All bets are off with regard to some of this progress. Again, if there is a response to annexation. Let me add a half a sentence, which is many of us were surprised that there was that little of a reaction to the U.S. Embassy going to Jerusalem. So we have no way of predicting how it's going to be, but I think it's important that we see that. Steve?
Yeah, let me just follow up. The and I would contrast the European, both Eastern and Western Europe situation from the States. Those of us who are of our age and been teaching for a few decades recall teaching about Judaism in North America commonly, almost routinely, with the phrase that there is no endemic pathological anti-Semitism in North America, the way there was not only in Europe, but much of the rest of the world, that we were exceptional. And until very recently, I think that was true when we were teaching a historical truth. That has changed now. And one of the many concerns about the reconsolidation and transformation of boundaries today is that the complexity of the 3 Ds that Michael just outlined in Europe and the depth in which they're ingrained both in Eastern and Western Europe, I'm afraid may start to arise here. It hasn't so far, and I think we have some strong breaks here, and we are a very different situation. But for the moment, at least, the continued rise of anti-Semitism in Eastern and Western Europe on these 3 different levels are continuing to accelerate, and so we just don't know what this current larger economic and health crisis is going to do, but it's unlikely to make that any better.
So,
and by the way, we have to say that Eastern Europe now has a double phenomenon taking place. Number one, you have those of us, and I worked in Eastern Europe intensively in the 80s and 90s and saw the birth of democracy. We've now seen the birth of authoritarian regimes and the endangerment of the great achievement of democracy that was the achievement of the 1990s. In Europe. None of us could have imagined for a moment that communism would fall without a bullet. And democracy looked like it was coming out and blossoming forth. And it was one of the most wonderful sights to see. We now have authoritarian governments that ironically tend to be pro-Israel and tend to be anti-Semitic toward their own Jewish population, both those who are alive there and toward the memory of the dead there, because they are the same nationalist forces in places like Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia and other areas, in Hungary in particular. They're the same forces that nurtured anti-Semitism during the Holocaust. They seek to shift all the blame to the Nazis, all the blame to the Germans, and not accept any blame themselves. Western Europe has a very interesting, different phenomenon, which is that the governments are virulently anti-Semitic, and there are segments of the population, most especially the Muslim population, that are responding to events in the Middle East and less part of the cultures of their country, even if they've lived in that country for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. But we also saw the defeat in England of Jeremy Corbyn, a significant defeat, in part because he was so anti-Israel that he accepted all forms of anti-Semitism. And the Labour Party is now trying to cleanse itself in England of systematic anti-Semitism. Not systematic, but widespread anti-Semitism.
So, gentlemen, boycotting Israel or Israeli goods, when might it be legitimate and when does it become anti-Semitic behavior?
Let me say that the one thing I'm going to say something terribly controversial. The whole thing with BDS is nothing. BDS has had absolutely zero impact on Israel's economy. It has not been effective on the college campuses. And in fact, you can't boycott Israel today because Israel is integrated into the global technological world. So if you boycott Israel, you have to give up your iPhone. You have to give up your Intel chips. You have to give up your Microsoft programs. You have to do a whole range of things. BDS is an attempt, a failed attempt to delegitimate Israel, and it's regarded as it's a nuisance rather than a significant problem. It manifests itself in campus. It has double reaction in campus. For some campuses, it calls Jewish identity to flourish in response to it. And for in other situations, it becomes divisive. But as a significant issue, I regard it as insignificant.
If I can hop in here, you describe this as controversial. It's not with me, because I completely agree with what you just said. I think we tend to hear from our friends in the Jewish community and among Jewish leadership, why are you letting BDS and why are you letting anti-Israeli sentiment run rampant on the campuses? I've not seen the kind of threat that is widespread in the community. So on that, in this regard, and so I think we agree on that point.
Thank you, Stephen. I think in the, for the sake of our time, unfortunately, we don't have that much time. I'm now going to move over to some of our audience and some of the questions we have. And the first one I'm looking for is from Stephen, is for Stephen. And the question is, Stephen, my understanding of life for Jews under Muslim control was limiting with many restrictions, and Jews still are considered as second-class citizens. Is this not true?
It's a complicated question. It is true that in Islamic law, Jews have a distinctive so-called secondary status, but that legal status is not necessarily translated into every national situation in the Muslim majority world. That's one point. The second point is that Jews did live under those circumstances as so-called second-class citizens for many hundreds of years, peacefully and prosperously. And many of the glories of Jewish culture from the Middle Ages arose in the Arabic language, in Judeo-Arabic, and not under Christianity. So there was a long period of time in which Jews and Muslims did live in what has been called by one of the leading scholars of the field, a creative symbiosis. That did not happen in Christianity, and I might just add that the perennial pathological anti-Judaism of medieval Europe got much, much worse, and that did not happen in the same way under Islam. So it is true that Jews did not have the same full citizenship status, if you want to put it that way, in the Muslim world. At the same time, the lived experience was, on the whole, not as bad as it was under Christianity.
Steve, can I follow up by asking you a question, which is that Jews were a protected people, and I'd like you to explain that under Islam.
Sure.
We share something common as people of the book.
Yeah, and as the Ahlul Kitab, the three Abrahamic traditions of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam were seen as a family, and one consequence was while we had a secondary citizenship compared to Islam as a whole, compared to all other religions and minorities, we had a higher status, which was as a people of the book, and that brought special protections. So while there were some limitations, there were also protections, and that allowed Jews to thrive. The Geniza, a vast repository of Jewish texts from the Muslim world in the Middle Ages, is quite extraordinary in one regard, and that is when it was studied very closely, it was discovered that virtually every occupation known was pursued by Jews. Jews were not ghettoized. They engaged in business for many centuries with Muslims, and in that sense did not experience harsh restrictions the way they did at the same time in Christianity.
Look, one of the great interreligious achievements of the last post-Holocaust era has been the transformation in the attitude of Christians toward Jews. And the Roman Catholicism, Roman Catholicism removed the idea that Jews were Christ killers by saying if Christ died for our sins, the reason for Christ's death was sinfulness. It then recognized the state of Israel. Pope John Paul II said anti-Semitism is anti-Christian. And only in the last 3 years, Pope Francis did something else, which is quite remarkable, which is he took away the mission to the Jews and said that Jews are living in the covenant, the original covenant with God, and therefore we have no need to proselytize them. This is a radical change, and it has ironically led to the best in the 2,000 years in which Jews and Christians have lived together. The relationship between Judaism and Roman Catholicism is at its best today. And that's, there is no historian who would not say that. Today, it's absolutely at its best today. And that's a remarkable sense of religious tolerance. It also is an important element because that concept of civility and multiple faiths comes out of American thinking and was introduced into the Roman Catholic Church by American religious thinkers. Back to you, Michelle.
Thank you. We've had many questions, and I'm watching them here regarding Black Lives Matter, and I'm going to try and incorporate them into one question for both of you for the sake of time. And that is, Black Lives Matter, Jews were active in the civil rights movement in the US in the 1960s and are overrepresented in the ranks of civil rights lawyers and activists. Yet some Black American leaders in recent decades have views. What do you see as the role of Jews in the Black Lives Matter movement? And is there still a natural alliance between the Black community and the Jewish community in the US?
Let me talk at that for a moment. Look, I was part of the civil rights movement. Andrew Goodman who was murdered in Philadelphia, Mississippi, was my classmate and my friend. I marched in those very marches, and I have a scar on my back from the treatment that I received in one of those marches. So I wear that every day. Jews in the 50s and 60s and Blacks were a natural alliance in part because we benefited by the barriers that were broken. When restrictive covenants were ruled unenforceable, all of a sudden Jews could buy property in places where they could never buy property before. Used to have covenants in titles which said you couldn't sell the Jews, you couldn't sell the Blacks, et cetera, et cetera. Supreme Court ruled that unenforceable. In a very real sense, when the barriers were broken at the university, the quotas ended for Jews as African Americans were being received in the university. And Jews thrived with the breaking of those barriers. Even the notion of Black pride introduced the concept that all of a sudden Jews could wear their religion with pride. In the 50s, you worried about being too Jewish, T-O-O Jewish. And that's, look at Eli the Fanatic as a story by Philip Roth as an example. And all of a sudden, in the 70s, Jews felt comfortable wearing Jewish stars, putting a kippah on their head, etc. Jews and Blacks also became rivals in the late 60s because 3 out of 4 of the whites that the African-American community encountered were Jews. The teacher, the social worker, the storekeeper, the landlord. Only the cop was not Jewish in terms of that. And Jews left areas where Blacks came in and they fled. That was the white flight to the suburbs in a dramatic way. Politically, Jews and Blacks have been allied all the way through. but a whole range of black leaders, especially leaders coming from the movement, felt that there was a certain capacity to introduce anti-Semitism into the mix and to attack the Jews and to, in that sense, replace the Jews. Black Lives Matter has an element of the leadership that comes from a tradition that's anti-Semitic. They've welcomed, for example, Louis Farrakhan, but they're going to find something very interesting now, and this is a moment to understand it, that if they want to be mainstream, and if they want to achieve political goals, they're not going to, and real goals in real life, they're not going to achieve that by fostering anti-Semitism and allowing the hatred of one group to fester. Let us hate the crime, let us hate the sin of racism, but let's leave room for all of us to work together. And that is the possibility in Jewish leadership, political leadership in particular, is not part of the problem, it's part of the solution.
I think the black leadership, young and old, are properly wary of much of the Jewish liberalism that Michael was describing, that was so important in the rise of civil rights and of legislation since then. We're going to have to see how the lines are going to change. I will just make one point, and that it seems to me there is a common enemy that we do want to keep in mind in the conversation, and that is extremist and violent white supremacy. Not just white, I'm not talking about just white, generalized white privilege. I'm talking about organized, violent white supremacists and extremists who hate Muslims, who hate, well, Muslims too, but they hate blacks as much as they do Jews. And that, in that sense, as a common enemy, there may be a paradoxical and perhaps even perverse positive.
Well, that's had a positive effect on Jewish-Muslim relations. It's also, ironically, Jewish-Muslim relations benefit by two other things. Number one, if there's an anti-circumcision move in any society, Jews and Muslims cooperate. And there is a deep alliance between Jews and Muslims on the food supply questions. Muslims trust the OU for kosher certification and will eat that. And when we introduced hot dogs to Dodger Stadium, one of the people that benefited by the ability to eat hot dogs were the Muslim population. And you can see kippot and burqas at Dodger Stadium on any given night in the old days when we used to have baseball played and baseball played with real fans in the stadium. May that day soon come again.
Inshallah.
Okay, I'm going to try and sneak in two more questions before we have to close. And the next question is going to be regarding the white supremacists. And that is if you can talk a little bit about the white supremacists and how they've been imparting their messages of anti-Semitism during COVID.
I will say that one of the, this has been a fairly short period of time, but we've already seen a substantial presence throughout the country, very boldly in Capitol buildings and in a variety of other public places, of long guns and of groups who are clearly organized around hatred of Jews and blacks. They are out really coming out of the woodwork, and to me, it's a matter of great concern. For example, it's becoming quite clear, and I think I feel quite confident it will be demonstrated that a considerable amount of the worst of the violence that came out of the past couple of weeks was instigated by these groups. They have long been, particularly the most virulent of them, have been anticipating the boogaloo or a generalized race war and they believe they can benefit basically by burning it all down, by creating chaos. And in that sense, African Americans and Jews have common cause, and we all have cause to be concerned by these groups.
Let me underscore that in two ways. Number one, there was a sense in the social media that was picked up by the police and communicated to the Jewish community that Jewish institutions would be targeted by these groups that were seeking to exacerbate the current situation to create a certain measure of race warfare. The second thing is we hear, well, I'm going to say two things now. We hear an echo of this with the notion that the Jews shall not replace us. What is this replacement? Clearly, the small population of Jews, and by the way, if you ask the average American how many Jews there are, they will give figures of 20 to 50 million. Everybody is Jewish because of the visibility and the prominence of Jews. But what Jews will not replace us means that they regard Jews as advocating policies that limit, restrict, transform the demography of the United States of America and that dilute the power of the whites. And in that sense, Jews are a primary target because they're dangerous in that they are diluting the powers of the white population. And that's not the color of the skin of white Jews, that's the policies that are advocated that express compassion, acceptance of the immigrant, and racial integration and the like. The third point I want to make on the notion of white supremacy is that we then become not white or conditionally white. And the president, let's leave aside when the president is or is not anti-Semitic. I don't want to touch that. The president signals by his rhetoric, signals an acceptance of these views and reinforces some anti-Semitic stereotypes. Let me give you two examples. When the president says, if you're not a good enough Jew unless you support me and support your prime minister, he's essentially reinforcing the notion that Jews have dual allegiance, in fact, primary allegiance to Israel and not the United States. When he says to the National Jewish Republican Coalition, I don't need your money, he's associating Jews with money and therefore influence. And when he says you guys are good negotiators, that's heard and perceived in the white supremacist community as Jews are what bargaining and quotation marks Jewing the population down. So he is regarded, and when he says there are good people on both sides, he's reinforcing the perception that one can be a neo-Nazi and a good person, which whether he intends it or not, and I want to be agnostic about that for a moment, because we don't have enough time to discuss it, whether he intends it or not, that's a signal as to what's acceptable, and that exacerbates the current situation.
And thank you, Michael. And I know we're going over time, but I have to ask the final question for you both. And certainly it's the final question. And that is, when you mentioned that BDS has been ineffective, but it makes many Jewish students feel unwelcome on campus. What, in your view, is the climate on US campuses for Jewish students, and what steps can be taken to improve it?
Michael and I were talking very briefly before we started. It seems to me we're at a moment where the future cannot be more opaque. Among other things, things are accelerating very, very rapidly. We're in the middle of three incomprehensibly large crises. And so I don't think there's any way to predict how that's going to change our universities. We don't even know how we're going to be teaching our classes yet, or how the students are going to fit into the dorms. So with some trepidation, I can only say from my view from the academy is, who knows?
Let me only say that Jews, we have to teach our kids and our students, and I know it from my own children, we have to teach them how to handle criticism of Israel and how to respond to it. And BDS was voted on by the student body at the University of Michigan. And for me, there was one very good side of that vote, which is my son was up till 3:30 in the morning arguing against BDS and was calling me in the middle of the night to get additional arguments and information. So for some Jews, that brings out a sense of Jewish pride. And the next year, the students at the University of Michigan, the Jewish students at the University of Michigan, organized. And what happened in between was they also began to listen to the criticisms of Israel so that they could begin to understand how to respond to them and how to deal with them. And that created a little bit of a better understanding. The way to equip our Jewish students is A, teach them marvelous things about being Jewish and Judaism so that they have a sense of pride and a sense of belonging, and B, to equip them to deal with some of the questions that are going to come their way. And one of the things that I've argued with the whole birthright thing is birthright doesn't equip the students to come back and to deal with some of the very important issues that they face on their campus. But overwhelmingly, Jews are going to continue to go to college. University is a very comfortable place for a whole range of people. It's a wonderful place for Jewish professors. Steve and I both feel very comfortable being Jews at our universities. I mean, mine is a Jewish university this time, but I've taught at non-Jewish universities all over the world. We feel comfortable teaching Judaism and Jewish subjects to non-Jews who welcome our teaching. And in fact, when I taught at a Roman Catholic university, we found something very interesting, that Roman Catholic students loved to take my course because they were religiously serious kids, but they had it up to here with priests and nuns and loved to hear the diversity and the dissent of Jewish thought, which ironically led them to become better Catholics because they could deal with their own Catholicism in more subtle and more informed ways. So the university is a good home in most places, and we have a different problem in the university, which is the university, some people want to regard the university as safe space, where I think most of us want to regard the university as challenging space that sharpens your intellect and that challenges your views and transforms and enlarges and makes your mind a lot better and maybe even touches your soul.
Thank you.
You're here.
Thank you. And Stephen and Michael, on behalf of the museum and all the listeners, we thank you both so much for this meaningful, compelling, and beyond interesting conversation. Thank you for joining us today. And to the audience and everybody listening, thank you for being part of this today. It's been absolutely compelling, and thank you so much. Before we sign off, I want to for one of our future will be next Tuesday at 11 a.m. Holocaust survivor, and then June 18 at 10 a.m. screening child survivor, back neurologist, followed by Q. David Minak. Further information at lamoth.org. So take care, everyone. We hope to see you again soon. And to Stephen and Michael, profuse thanks from all of us. Thank you.
Thank you for asking.
Thank you.
Thank you.